PSO2 Global's Episode 5 release raised the level cap to 90, and we will soon be seeing the 95 cap too. This now means we have just about enough skill points to take everything we would ever really want or need for most classes. So, unlike the video I did at the level 80 cap, where I suggested where to put your new skill points, it may be easier for everyone if this time around, I mainly just stick to explaining which skills are still not really worth your points, even at the 95 cap. I'd also like to get it out of the way now by saying that because of S-grade augments now being a thing in Global, that there are going to be a lot more niche ways to build classes trees around these certain things. So if you're going for one of these builds, awesome. But keep in mind that this video is targeted to those who want a base understanding of why some skills still are generally not worth taking. I will, however, still mention a few of these niche skills along the way though. One last thing to mention before getting into this is for you newer players to make sure to get your 14 client order skill points from your corresponding NPC class trainer on the stairs in the gate area. They will start you off with a client order that gives 5 skill points, then another order for another 5 after you complete that one. Then you will get 4 more client orders that will reward you with 1 skill point each at the cost of class-specific X cubes, which you can acquire by leveling up again after reaching the level cap. So with that out of the way now, let's get right into it. Starting with Hunter, no matter which stance you go with, you will now be able to completely take Hunter Physique, Automate, and Iron Will if that's something you were interested in before. However, keep in mind that you will have a few more skill points to play around with when using Guard Stance. Anyways, as usual, all these straight stat up skills at the top of the tree give a poor return on your skill point investment. Then, moving down to the bottom of the tree and starting from the left, Critical Fury can usually be ignored unless you can make up a lot of extra crit through your subclasses, rings, and gear. This skill will see more use when pairing Hunter with the Phantom or a 12 subclass, though those two classes are not yet available on Global at the time of making this video. Moving over a little, Guard Stance Up is nice, but the flash guards below it basically do the same exact thing, but for less points. Below that, we have Absorption, which requires you to be very close to a target to gain any effects. And it also requires you to have a few points in it to even make it worthwhile. Whereas Healing Guard, at the top of the tree, returns 5% HP every time you perfect block and only costs 1 skill point. Lastly, Guard Stance Poison, Stance Burn, and Not Bad are extremely situational, as most statuses can just be ignored in this game. Though for some bosses and future updates, this might be helpful, but in general, they still never really see any use. All in all, the Hunter still has a bit to choose from after you have the core of your build, so just spec into whatever else you think might suit you best after you have your core. I try not to ever really give my personal opinions in these videos, but to give you an idea of what I do when using a Hunter as a main, at the level 90 cap, I go with Guard Stance, then I take all of Iron Will, Automate, and Hunter Physique, and then 2 of the Flash Guards. And as far as what to spec into when using Hunter as a sub, just follow the same advice, but make sure to be using Fury Stance, as Guard Stance Advanced does not work as a subclass. Also, Fury Critical can be pretty helpful on a Hunter sub too, but that really depends on what you are pairing it with, and the gear you are using along with it too. Next up is the Fighter, and like usual, most of the straight setup skills at the top can be ignored. However, melee power up 2 and 3 are decent enough to take depending on what else you do or don't take further down in the tree. Then if we go all the way down to the bottom left, the Chaser skills can add a bit of damage to your kit for only a few points each. Then, Half-Line Boost and Chaser Bind are something you'd only really want to look into if you wanted a status build, and they would work with the other Chaser skills very well. Lastly, Deadline Slayer and Photon Slayer are actually pretty decent too, so you could always opt to put points into those instead of the melee power-ups up top. However, keep in mind that Deadline Slayer essentially only sees any use when you are in overload, and Photon Slayer is generally only working half the time, unless you specifically play in a way that will keep your PP low to make use of this. So with that all said, when it comes to Fighter, almost all of its tree can be utilized depending on how you want to play. And when it comes to using Fighter as a subclass, just take the points you would use on main class only skills, like Overload, and just toss them into the melee power-ups or really wherever else you think you may need. Moving on, we have Braver, and now is the time where if you wanted to play hybrid, you can take literally everything at the bottom of the tree. Just keep in mind that you don't really need to max the stance criticals, or even take them at all depending on which subclass and gear you use. Now, as far as what's not worth taking, there's actually not much, besides Dexterity up 1 and 2 at the top. Sidestep Plus can always be helpful for 2 or so points if you want, and Perfect Recovery Heal is actually really nice at level 1 as well. So basically, just take everything you need for your core at the bottom, then take any extra quality of life and straight stat up skills at the top after that with whatever points you have left over. Next up is Bouncer, and this class is in a very similar situation as how we just described Braver, as in there is actually very little you don't want and can't take with the added skill points. Starting at the bottom this time and working our way up, these stance criticals don't need to be maxed depending on your subclass and gear. Elemental Burst kinda forces you to go against how Bouncer is meant to be played, so it's generally not taken. Next, heal sharing sounds nice, but it takes about 2 or 3 points to even make it somewhat worthwhile. There are far worse skills you can take than this, but your party might get more use out of you just by charging a Megaverse or Resta. Then, healing bonus below it is even less useful now that we have crafted Resta, and just tapping Megaverse can still completely heal you too, so there's generally really no need for the extra 15% healing bonus. Perfect recovery PP gain isn't really needed, as Bouncer has some of the best active PP regeneration. Then, Sidestep Plus isn't really needed either, as Bouncer has tons of iframes through their weapon actions. Though, as usual, 2 points in it can be helpful. As far as crafting mastery goes, we're getting updates so fast that this probably won't see much use. Lastly, if you have any points left over, dumping them into melee power up 1 and 2 couldn't hurt, but just be sure to avoid putting anything into dexterity up. Moving away from the melee classes, we then have Ranger, which is quite simple. First off, ignore the straight stat up skills at the top, though while we are at the top, a few points into advanced dive roll can be very helpful. Moving down a few rows, Tool Mastery simply increases the damage of your traps, but this is not necessary as your traps are not meant for damage, but merely for crowd control and PP regen. Though 1 point is required in Tool Mastery to unlock Tactical Trap, which is extremely important for your trap's PP regen. Next, the custom spring and poison traps only increase the potency and rate at which poison will land, which isn't really necessary. Moving down another row, first hit only gives you a 20% damage bonus when you hit an enemy when it's at full health. In theory, this sounds pretty good, but the enemies that this would be helpful on will likely die too fast anyways. Eradication bonus requires you to be extremely close to an enemy to gain its effects, and this kind of works against how Ranger is meant to be played. Lastly, these 4 special rounds are highly situational, and generally ignored outside of very specific content, and even then it's still not always worth it. We then have the Gunner, and this one is extremely simple. Just take everything besides the straight stat up skills, Advanced Aerial, and Automate Deadline. Advanced Aerial only grants you a damage bonus when attacking an enemy that is in the air, and Automate Deadline only uses a mate item when your health drops below 25%. So both of these are pretty situational, and there are many more important things in this tree that pertain to Gunner's playstyle. Lastly, you likely won't be able to max Showtime or Showtime Star, but a few points in each will still be very helpful. Next up is Summoner, and starting at the top, maxing HP up from 1 to 5 only gives 30 more HP, so it's really not worth it. Right below it is HP Restorate, which is usually maxed when using Summoner as a subclass, but when using it as a main class, you will likely be tossing out Rest a bit for your pet, so these points could be used better elsewhere. But it is still a really nice quality of life skill to have if you really want to take it. Quick Recovery simply reduces the duration of specific debuffs, and since they don't show up much, it's usually overlooked. Unstoppable Recovery isn't really needed, as you should generally be doing most of your healing through tax. And there's also the Atomizer Fanatic left ring you can use, which makes you completely invulnerable when using atomizers. Pet Photon Barrier has a very low proc rate, even at max, so it's generally not taken. Advanced Photon Blast is extremely niche, and only boosts your Photon Blast damage by 30%. HP Mega Up takes 10 whole points to give 100 HP. It's not terrible to take though if you opt out of taking the PP up skills. Lastly, the Total Defense and Dexterity up skills take a lot of points to see a good return, and you have DM Master for damage reduction as it is on Summoner anyways. When it comes to using Summoner as a subclass, just ignore the main class only skills and put any extra points into HP Restorate and or any of the straight setup skills you like at the bottom. Moving on to the Force, it should first be mentioned that this is very dependent on what kind of elemental masteries you plan to take. I'll be going over this assuming you are using all 3, but if you don't, then you'll just have more points to play around with. So, getting right to it, these straight stat ups at the top aren't really worth taking. The PP ups are nice, but they take a lot of points. Moving down, Advanced Normal Tech only boosts damage to non-charged techniques, so you'll likely never really see any use for this, as ideally you should be charging just about everything. Photon Flare and its modifiers are quite interesting, but take into consideration that they take a lot of skill points to only get a damage buff for Photon Flare's duration. Also keep in mind that the more and more gear we get and more updates we get, the higher the average base tech power will be. So stuff like Photon Flare that gives you more tech power will only end up scaling down and down, whereas the Elemental Masteries give straight % damage to increase techs all the time. With that being said, 2 points into Photon Flare to unlock Photon Flare Afterburst is really nice. On top of that, just having Photon Flare unlocked gets you access to the Force's level 85 skill, that when after using Photon Flare, you get another buff. Then moving all the way down, the Elemental Mastery boosts simply increase the chance of you landing a status effect when using techs, and the rate on these is actually pretty low too. They can be useful in some niche builds, but in general, they don't usually see too much use. Next, Freeze Detonation is actually a rather fun skill, but unfortunately it takes a bit of skill points and has a cooldown as well. Now before moving on from Force, it should be mentioned that you should always first spec 2 or 3 points into the Mastery 1s to unlock and then max Mastery 2s, as Mastery 2s give the same damage bonus at the cost of only 5 skill points as the Mastery 1s give at 10 whole skill points. Later on, when you have more skill points to play around with, then go back and max out the Mastery 1s. Next up is the Techter, and just like the Force, this is highly dependent on how you want to play the class. In general, the stat ups at the top can be ignored as usual, but these melee and tech power-ups can be useful when playing a melee Techter with a Hunter sub. Moving down, the only skills you might not want to take in the center region are Advanced Resta, as Crafted Resta is really strong as it is, and Reverser Field, as anyone could throw out a Moon Atomizer whenever, whereas Reverser Field takes a bunch of skill points and has a long cooldown. PP Restorate and PP Conversion are very nice to have to maintain your resources, but if you plan to play hybrid or mostly caster, you might want to allocate those points into the Masters at the bottom. Then, just like the Force, the Mastery boosts generally are not worth it either. Last but not least, I figured I'd mention Hero since Global has it now too. But when it comes to Phantom, Etoile, and Luster, I'll be covering those in their own videos when they release. So if you have not seen my Hero Basics video, Hero can take literally everything in the tree, but usually end up ignoring the bottommost 4 skills as they give a pretty bad return on your skill point investments. And that's about it for what's really not worth taking on each class's skill trees. Please keep in mind that these are just suggestions and general examples of why certain skills don't perform nearly as well as others. All I ask is that you take what I've mentioned here today into consideration, then do whatever you want after that. So long as you understand what everything does in each tree, that's all that really matters. If you have a more specialized build in mind that requires specific gear to accomplish that, then I can only encourage you to try it out. And feel free to ask me about it before you go along with it if you have any questions or concerns. But keep in mind that additional skill trees cost real money, and we don't see free resets that often. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.